press record and that should pop up on your screen now. So I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our guest speaker here today, Rebecca Last, who has been gardening on and off since age 8 and has been a member of Master Gardeners of Ottawa Carleton since 2005. Her small suburban garden is certified by the Canadian Wildlife Federation as wildlife habitat. Rebecca grows a dozen or more varieties of heritage tomatoes every year. Yum. Her garden design includes elements of permaculture, and she has been honored to receive several awards from the Ontario horticulture community. Aside from getting her hands dirty, Rebecca is also passionate about the science behind gardening. Not a scientist herself, a big part of her career was translating science into terms that would resonate with the public. Now retired, she uses these same skills to share what she learns about gardening and plant science via her blog, Gardening at Last. And I'll make sure to add the link in the chat afterwards. Rebecca also shares her own research and writing on ResearchGate, where her publications have garnered over 10,000 reads. Rebecca's gardening addiction is enabled by her loving husband, Richard, and a collection of very spoiled rescue cats. Oh, I love it. I'm such a cat person too. So thank you so much for being here, Rebecca, and to everyone who's joining us live and everyone watching the recordings. I'm going to pass it over to you, Rebecca, and I'm going to pop in the chat your blog link as well as the research links too. Thanks, Rebecca.
Well, thanks so much, Katie. That was a great introduction. So we're going to talk about the practical side of how we can manage climate change in our gardens today. And as Katie said, I'm not a scientist. So I actually come at this from a policy perspective. In the late 90s, early 2000s, I was the Director of Programs and Policy for the Canadian Environment Industry Association. And I was in that role when Canada signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, which was 1997. That was the first international agreement that nations were going to start to do something about climate change. And our association was invited by, in those days, it was called the Business Council on National Issues. And interestingly enough, this group, which represented most of the major polluting industries in North America and in Canada, they tried to kind of dig their heels and fight climate change. And as a result, that group no longer exists under that name. They actually had to rebrand. They're now called the Canadian Council of CEOs. So it was a really interesting experience to be kind of seated around a policy table with the president of Exxon Canada and the president of the Canadian Gas Association and the Canadian Electrical Association and the Canadian Mining Association and so forth. And what really happened quite rapidly was some fissures between the groups like the Canadian Gas and Electric Associations, who could position themselves as clean energy versus Exxon and a few of the others who couldn't. But in any case, so that's a little bit about my background. I want to tell you a little bit about this presentation as well, because climate change is a massive, massive topic. I do try and stay on top of the research relating to climate change, carbon sequestration in soils, plant science related to heat events and extreme weather events. And because of that policy background, I also try and kind of keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening at the international negotiations. I'm a lot less successful on that these days because honestly, it's like massive amounts of material. So I'm trying to pick and choose here, and I'm also trying to present information that doesn't become so overwhelming that you just want to, go bury your head in the sand and say, I can't deal with this, which is an easy reaction to have sometimes. I want to start out with a few key messages, because I think we still sometimes hear from people who, whether it's the head in the sand complex or just, that wonderful human ability to deny things, they don't want to believe that climate change is real. How many of you have seen that wonderful Netflix movie called Don't Look Up? It's Yeah. So there is still some of that out there. And my first message is Mother Nature doesn't care what we believe. So we're just going to park our beliefs for tonight. Climate change, according to all of the credible science, is real. It's happening now. Katie was telling me that in Vancouver, she's just starting to see the hot weather arrive there. Nicole in Ottawa with me, we've been sweltering through plus 30-degree temperatures during the day, which is not, it's a little early for that to happen in Ottawa. But what's unusual is that it's not cooling off at night, and that's problematic for people who don't have air conditioning or a way to cool themselves off. And you've probably seen the headlines saying that May was the 12th consecutive month in a row where global climate or global temperature records were breached. So we're hitting all those high points in not a good way. The other thing about climate change is that people still talk a little bit about global warming. And really what climate change is us as humans not so much increasing the temperature of the planet, we're changing Earth's chemistry and we're changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. And that's why things are getting hotter, but also less predictable. I've heard climate change referred to as global climate weirding. And I think that's a better way of thinking about it than global warming. I mean, when you live in a place like Ottawa and it's February and it's minus 20, global warming actually sounds like not such a bad idea. But that's not what's happening. We're seeing, those polar vortexes, and we're seeing, floods and droughts and all those extreme weather events that are not just warming. The scary news is that we're getting close to some tipping points that will make Earth uninhabitable. And we have passed that 1.5 degrees Celsius warming that the International Panel on Climate Change recommended we try to avoid. We'll see what that means in a few more slides. But it's not too late, and there are things that we can all do. So I've got those two messages bolded and highlighted because I think that's the most important messages. Those are the most important messages I'd like you to take away today. That DOI number, by the way, down at the bottom, that's where you can find this presentation if you want to go back to it. I did upload a more recent version of it earlier this year, so it's got some of the more recent slides in it. So today we're going to be talking about key concepts. What is climate change? Where are we now? Where we're going and what we can do most importantly in terms of climate proofing our garden. I'll end up with a few notes of hope on the horizon and some further reading and resources. With a really small group like this, if you have an urgent question, please feel free to ask it during the presentation. That's quite okay. Just be warned that, I can talk about this a lot. And so Katie might need to rein me in and let me know that we're running over time. So the concept of the tipping point, I found this image online and I just thought this is so perfect, right? We've got this egg and it's very balanced, but you put your foot down too heavily somewhere near there, that egg is going to fall. So I think it was, I can't remember the author's name. It'll come to me. There's an author who wrote a book on tipping points. And the idea is just that it's the point at which a series of small changes or incidents become significant enough to cause a larger, more important change. So, you can think of it as a phase change, a change in the state of things. Think about that egg in boiling water. After a minute in boiling water, the yolk and the albumin are still liquid. After 3 minutes, they've had a phase change. And so 3 minutes in boiling water for that egg is a tipping point at which the nature of the egg fundamentally changes. It goes from being raw to being cooked. What we're seeing here is a picture. This is from 2018. And one of the tipping points that we look at is tundra melting. Tundra in the northern hemisphere is primarily frozen bogs. And as long as that permafrost remains frozen, it's locking up huge amounts of carbon and, more importantly, huge amounts of methane. And what we're seeing in this picture under the thin ice in this Arctic lake is methane bubbles coming up to the top. In my career with Natural Resources Canada, one of the groups that I did planning and reporting for was the Polar Continental Shelf Program that flies scientists up to the Arctic every year. And the scientists would come back and they'd say, some of those lakes up there, they're very shallow. And a lot of them are drying out because it's extremely hot up there. It gets, if we have 1.5 degrees warming globally in most of inhabited Canada, you've got about 2 to 2.5 degrees of warming. In the Arctic, it's closer to 4 degrees of warming. And so these lakes are drying out, but before they dry out, you can hold a lighter to them and set them on fire because of the amount of methane, which is a natural gas that's percolating up through. And that's what you can see, those little round circles on the ice, that's methane. And that is potentially a tipping point. Another potential tipping point is ice and snow melting. Ice and snow tend to be white, highly reflective. They reflect a lot of sunlight. And as they melt, they're exposing dark-colored soils, dark-colored water that actually absorbs heat. So that's another tipping point close to. Few more key terms here. Weather is the state of the atmosphere at any given time and place. So today in Ottawa, it's kind of overcast, humid, hot and sticky. Climate, however, is the weather that characteristically prevails in a particular region. So we can say Ottawa's climate is typically cooler than it is in Georgia. And climate change in this context, we are talking about global climate change happening due to natural variability or to human activity. And with the tilt and wobble of the sun, there have been periods in Earth's history, going back, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of years, where we've seen fairly dramatic global climate change. And in the archaeological record, we've seen regional climate change, such as the drying events that appear to have wiped out the Mayan civilization in what is now Mexico, and the Pueblo civilizations in the Four Corners region of the United States. Another couple of key terms you're going to hear are mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is the idea that we can do things to try and slow that global warming climate change trend. Adaptation is acknowledging that a lot of the damage has already happened. We're going to have to live with it for a while. So what are the things that we can do to adapt to climate change? And in the presentation tonight, I will be focusing mostly on adaptive measures for our gardens, but I'll talk a little bit about mitigation as well. And the nice thing is that there's a few things in the middle, that little red leaf-shaped place there, where actions can actually contribute to both mitigation and adaptation. Learning more about climate change, as I hope you're doing tonight. Buying local food, conserving water, investing in new energy systems, more renewable or more energy efficient appliances, planting trees. These are all things that we can do to both mitigate and also adapt to climate change. Now, some of the gases that I talked about methane, but typically when we talk about climate change, what we're talking about is a buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. And I like to think of CO2 or carbon dioxide as kind of the US dollar. It's like the universal currency of greenhouse gas greenhouse gases, because we can convert everything else into CO2, and it just makes it easier to understand that. I am seeing some questions here, so I'm just going to have a quick look at those. Malcolm Gladwell, yes, thank you. That's the dude I was thinking, whose name I couldn't get. Wondering if later in the presentation I could possibly contact you to request any suggested local contacts that you may have in the area of planetary health. And that was from Nicole. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to chat. Yeah. Okay, so carbon dioxide is increasing at a rate of about 2.4 parts per million per year. The bad news about CO2 is that it's got a lifespan in the atmosphere of 50 to 200 years. So stuff we were putting up in the atmosphere when I was born is still there and could be there long after my, great nieces and nephews have passed. I mentioned methane in the context of that Arctic lake. And there are some human sources of methane. Many of them are natural. Amongst the human sources are anaerobic bacterial composition. So, for example, rice paddies, garbage dumps, and cattle. You also get some methane from mining, fracking, and wood burning. Nitrous oxide is an interesting one. It's, sorry, I should say methane is the equivalent of 22 to 25 units of CO2. Nitrous oxide is almost 300 times as potent as CO2 in terms of its warming potential. It has increased over 30% in the last 36 years. It's got a fairly long lifespan in comparison to methane, which is only a dozen or so years. The nitrous oxide lifespan is comparable to CO2. It's about 100, 150 years. This comes a lot from nitrogen-based chemical fertilizers and also from burning fossil fuels. So one of the things that we used to see in the context of acid rain was discussions about NOx and SOx. NOx being nitrous oxide, SOx being sulfur dioxide. And those were two of the big chemicals that were spewed into the atmosphere by coal burning fire energy stations, for example. And then we get the more exotic CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons. These are entirely man-made, and they have a massive lifespan, up to 10,000 years in the atmosphere. They were typically used as coolants in refrigerators, air conditioners, but also in insulation and aerosol sprays. And you probably have noticed we see a lot fewer aerosol sprays on the shelves these days. They're more likely to be pump sprays. And in fact, one of the things that makes me hopeful still about climate change is that we actually managed to solve the issue of chlorofluorocarbons, which were eating a hole in the ozone layer, as a result of an agreement called the Montreal Protocol. And I always have to look this up. When the heck was that? Signed in 1987. And the Montreal Protocol created a legally binding global accord where world leaders agreed on a course of action to reduce CFCs in the atmosphere. And as a result, the hole in the ozone layer has been starting to repair itself. So, we can mess up the planet big time, but we also have the capability, when the political will is there, to actually start to heal the planet. And that gives me tremendous hope. Let's have a quick look here. So another question from Nicole. Briefly read a headline that heat stress, even on native plants, is leading to an increase in VOCs. Yeah, a lot of plants use VOCs as a defense system. So it's one of the ways they signal each other when they're under stress. That could be heat stress, but more usually it's used, those VOCs are used to either repel herbivores or to signal to other plants in the vicinity that this particular plant is under attack. So if you think about fragrant plants, whether it's the sort of piney smell of pine trees or lavender or plants that have a licorice smell to them, all of these are VOCs, volatile organic compounds, that many of which are actually quite useful to humans because they have a nutritional value, but they are also signaling agents and protective agents for plants who, unlike us, can't get up and run away when they're being attacked. And yeah, heat stress does a lot of interesting things to a lot of different organisms. And we're going to touch on some of them, but not in a great deal of detail. Some of you may have heard of the infamous hockey stick graph that was briefly discredited by a study that didn't use particularly good science, but has subsequently been reinstated. And in fact, this is what we're seeing now. We are now up here on the hockey stick, or maybe even somewhere. The two colors of dots are drawn from two data sets that provide proxy information about atmospheric levels of CO2. So the Sippel Station ice core is able to go back hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years in some cases. And it allows us to measure the CO2 in these great long tubes of ice that are drilled into glaciers. And in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, they are able to take readings that provide the red dots, which are a little bit more recent. And these are data points that are showing that our atmospheric CO2 levels are rising at an exponential rate. And actually, one of the slides that I hid for tonight's presentation in the interest of time talks about how difficult it is for our brains to understand that concept of exponential growth. We understand arithmetic progressions very easily, but when something is doubling and then doubling again and then doubling again, as you see with an exponential curve, that's a really hard thing for our brains to understand. I took a look at some of the events that had happened recently in the Ottawa area. So this is 2017. I live about 100 yards from the Ottawa River. My neighborhood is protected by a berm, and our house is just high enough that in 2017 and again in 2019, when we had massive flooding in the Ottawa River, we got water touching the bottom of our foundation, and our sump pump went on for the first time in the 30-some years that we'd lived here. But we didn't suffer the kind of extreme flooding damage that you're seeing in this picture here. In 2018, we had a tornado touch down in several places in Ottawa. Over 250,000 people went without power. And this is what one of Ottawa's neighborhoods looked like. One of my gardening friends actually lived in this neighborhood, which is just west of where I am. It's an area called Dunrobin, not too far from the Ottawa River. 2019, another state of emergency due to flooding. I think this picture was taken east of me in Cumberland, which is a little downstream of where I am. And we had flooding. We were, filling sandbags and driving them around the neighborhood here, but it was worse in Cumberland. And actually, what you see, this black thing here, I believe is one of the inflatable berms they use to try and keep the waters at bay, that were somewhat successful. 2021, Katie and I were talking about this just before we went online. And this was the heat dome that descended over the lower mainland of British Columbia. The headline here, which is from the Times, says dozens dead. Subsequently, it turned out that there were about 670 people who died in that heat dome. And interestingly enough, the biggest predictor of mortality was income level. Um, People who were living on low income typically were living in places where they did not have access to air conditioning. In many cases, they were living in high rises where they couldn't even open the windows. And consequently, they did not do well. And a lot of them died, unfortunately. This is actually a photo that was taken by some friends of ours who live in Victoria. And it was July 2021. This thermometer is on their back porch, and it's in the shade. It's not in the sun, and it's showing 45 degrees Celsius. So, and I'm sorry, it's Celsius is, I don't even know what that is in Fahrenheit. I'm sorry, but it's really hot. It's over 100 degrees, and also humid. And it's that combination of high humidity and high heat, which can be fatal because the high humidity means that your body is just not able to cool itself. Moving on to 2022, I think this is. I'm just going to have to peek underneath here. Sorry, 2023. This is last year. We had nearly 900 wildfires burning across Canada. Massive, massive areas of the boreal forest just burnt. And we had about a week in Ottawa where the air quality was significantly bad enough that we had to keep the house closed up. Now, fortunately, it happened when Ottawa was going through a relatively cool period. But you can imagine that if you have really bad air quality and really high ambient air temperatures in cities, you're going to see a lot of people in a lot of distress. Also in 2023, there was another little tornado that touched down. It only damaged about 30 or 40 homes. But what we're seeing is that, pretty much in each of the last 6, 7 years, we have seen extreme weather events in Ottawa. And, I tend to generally give this presentation to people in Ottawa. But if you think about where you live in the world and you track those extreme weather events, I'm pretty sure that you would find a similar kind of scenario in whatever part of the world that you live in. And part of the reason for that, 2024 will be our first glimpse of Earth at 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think in Ottawa, we've certainly been seeing something close to that for the last week. And hopefully we'll see those temperatures drop again next week. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is from February 2024, February of this year. The first 12 months above 1.5 degrees warming, according to the Climate Monitor. By the way, this is a picture taken of one of the tributaries to the Amazon. The Amazon River and its tributaries are the main mode of transportation throughout much of Brazil. And when the water levels fall, people can't get around. These boats are stranded. They can't go anywhere. And another thing that happens is that hydroelectric power often doesn't work too, because there's not enough water to power the generators. So what's happening in a lot of these instances where we have extreme weather events is that the weather kind of gets stuck in one mode. And this is just a little clip from NOAA, I believe, the North American Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, which tracks weather patterns. And it's talking about what's happening to the Gulf Stream under climate change. So I'm just going to play 10 seconds and you can tell me if you can hear it or not.
The reason there are jet streams is because of the differences in temperature between different sections of the world. And that difference in temperature is what creates the force that drives these winds. As global warming is occurring, the Arctic is warming much faster than areas farther south. That means that this difference in temperature is not as large as it used to be. And so there's less force driving the winds of the jet stream. When the jet stream gets weaker, when those west to east winds slow down, the jet stream tends to travel in a wavier path. They're actually what create the dynamics in the atmosphere that creates weather patterns. Once those waves get quite large, then the weather patterns can become so slow that in effect they get stuck.
So that's kind of what we're seeing happen here, is that those weather patterns, hang on a second, for some reason it's not allowing me to move on to the next slide. There we go. Oh, no, that didn't work. I'm just going to stop share for a second and go back to my presentation. Huh. Pardon me. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. We'll cheat.
No worries at all, Rebecca.
I'll say hi, everyone. Thanks for joining, and sorry I'm late. I had a meeting with someone in Australia, which I have to do in the evening. So thought I would be back earlier, but it's nice to see everybody. Thanks for coming.
Nice to see you too, Alexa. So what we're seeing with that Gulf Stream slowing down is weather patterns getting stuck. And as a gardener, I'm completely obsessed with precipitation during the summer. Temperature too, to some extent, but I watch for rain like a hawk. And, you know, sometimes we'll get a week of rain solidly, and then the next 3 weeks, there's no rain at all. And obviously, as gardeners, we would prefer things to be a little bit spread out. The warmer air, the warmer atmosphere also means that weather systems are more energetic. Warmer air holds more water. It is more inclined to give us deluges in the summer, and in the wintertime, these massive snow dumps that as they melt can lead to flooding in the spring, and extremes like ice storms and droughts and tornadoes. So what can we do to protect our gardens from all of these extremes? And one of the most important things is mulching to protect plant roots. So these extremes of weather can be kind of a good news, bad news story for gardeners, because in one sense, we can sometimes push the envelope a little bit more. Ottawa, for example, and I know in the US, you've also recently had an update on your grow zone map. In Canada, we've done the same thing. Our grow zone map was updated about almost a decade ago, I think. They came out with the which has moved the data from 10 years later than it was in the earlier map. And it shows, you know, that Ottawa's gone from being a 4B grow zone to a 5A grow zone. So, you know, we are able to grow plants that wouldn't have survived the winters previously. That's the good news. And, you know, we can be a little bit more successful with some of those exotic plants. The bad news is, unfortunately, all of this variability, which makes it harder to predict what's going on. So some of the things that we can do to deal with these extreme temperatures and with climate change, we can mulch to protect our roots. We can provide shelter for plants. And the picture on the lower left-hand side is one from Nikki Jabbour, who's a very successful gardener and garden writer and speaker in Nova Scotia. And Nikki will tell you that what she's done here is to put shade cloth over a bed of lettuce, which provides just enough cooling that she gets about an extra 2 weeks out of her lettuce before it starts to bolt. One of the other things that's a slightly longer term strategy, but it's a really important one, is to save the seeds from your most successful plants, because each successive generation of seeds contains epigenetic information about the weather and climatic conditions where that plant grew successfully. And so the seeds that you're saving are like a little snapshot of what those conditions were and how this seed was able to survive, or how this plant was able to survive them. Now, I'm sure we've all heard about things like the Svalbard Doomsday Seed Vault. Kew Gardens has a seed vault. There are a number of other seed vaults around the world, which are hedges against catastrophic changes to our climate or to our planet. However, if these seeds aren't grown out on a regular basis, they're no longer carrying current epigenetic information that will allow them to survive in our current climate. And let's face it, how many times have you visited this Svalbard, seed vault? Probably never. I'd love to, but I don't think they're going to let me in there. So what I can do is I can save seeds of my own plants that I've grown from one year to the next. And those seeds will be adapted to the specific growing conditions in my garden, which, by the way, is on the north side of a hill facing the Ottawa River. So it's a little different from the rest of Ottawa. So that very specific information in that seed is part of what's going to allow me to be successful as a gardener, and most importantly, as a food gardener in future years. We're also seeing changes to our water supply. I mentioned the air is becoming more humid, and our waters are becoming more humid. And this is a little problematic because warmer water absorbs less oxygen and can become acidic more easily. In fact, one of the things that we've benefited from over the last 30 or 40 years is that a lot of the atmospheric CO2 has been soaked up by the ocean. It's being stored in the ocean. And our oceans are now significantly more acidic than they were 30 or 40 years ago, with the result that shellfish are suffering because their shells are basically calcium. Calcium dissolves in acid, and so this is problematic on a number of levels. We're also seeing a lot less winter snow cover, and that means less spring melt. Now, in those two flood events that I talked about in 2017 and 2019, those were actually precipitated by massive snow melt upstream from where I live. So that would be the whole of the Ottawa River watershed going all the way up to Madawaska, and not quite as far as Hudson Bay, but it goes a long way up there. So less snow cover in this part of the world is not catastrophic, but less snow cover out west, that can mean a really difficult time for farmers that grow so much of our food. And of course, we talked about extremes in precipitation, going from drought to floods and back again. We also, what else can we do about those extremes in water? Well, we can mulch. Mulch is huge. Canada's Changing Climate Report for 2019 notes that as temperatures increase, there'll continue to be a shift from snow to rain, especially in the shoulder seasons, spring and fall. And near-term increases in atmospheric water vapor in southern Canada that should translate into more precipitation. So we are seeing that. So, and of course, we're also seeing extreme precipitation increasing. So Katie, mulching and seed saving activities in the growth activity database. Excellent. I think, Nicole, you're correct that it was in Brazil. And Katie's providing a translation, 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Alexa and Katie both. So yeah, that's a lot. That's a very high temperature. It certainly feels high. So yeah, mulch is a really, really useful strategy for all kinds of things. Mulch insulates our soil. It keeps weeds down, as we know. It insulates our soil from extremes in temperature. So mulching in the fall or leaving your leaves on your garden beds in the fall is a great strategy at a time when we're not sure how much snow cover we're going to get. And this past winter actually was not a good winter for snow cover. We didn't have very much snow cover at all. And that snow cover is typically the insulation we rely on to keep our perennial plants healthy over the winter. So leaving the leaves is a good option. I'm showing pictures of shredded wood here, or wood mulch, which is one of the better ones you can use. And sad to say, along with climate change, we're also seeing invasive species like the emerald ash borer, which are wiping out a lot of native trees in our area. So there's actually a lot of wood mulch out there. So that's the silver lining on that one. And often when I hear chainsaws going in my neighborhood, or I hear the shredder going in my neighborhood, I'll take my little wheelie bin down there and get a free bin or two of wood mulch that I can use on my garden. You can also save water. Now we have 3 rain barrels in our house. Each one of them cost in the range of 150 to 200 bucks. This photo was provided by one of my fellow master gardeners, and it's a picture of a rain tote. So each of my rain barrels is 125 liters or thereabouts. I think I've got one that's around 200 liters. This is 1,000 liters, and it cost under $200. Now it's designed for agricultural use, and so you do have to put an adapter here so that you can hook it up to a garden hose. But if you've got the space for a rain tote, it actually makes financially a lot more sense than different rain barrels. It's cheaper and it holds more water. And this was a picture Catherine took just after it was installed, but she assured me she was planning on growing vines up it because it's not the prettiest thing in the world. Some of you may be old enough, maybe not on this call, but I'm old enough to remember a city campaign called Tuna Can Your Water. And the idea was that you put a tuna can, an inch or so deep, a couple of centimeters deep, put that out on your lawn, and you would run your sprinkler until the tuna can was full. And that was all you needed to water your lawn every week. And if it rained and it filled the tuna can, you didn't need to water your lawn at all. So this idea of rationing our water, if you live in Calgary right now, you're rationing your water for a whole other reason. But in times when we don't have as much snow melt in the spring, we don't have our reservoirs being filled up quite as regularly and reliably, or they're overflowing. And so you can't save the water because it's overflowing the banks. It's a really good idea to start using your water more wisely. If you have a vegetable bed or you have an area where you have plants that are water thirsty, like a timer and a drip irrigation hose like this is a great way to go. Now, I have to say that one of my big disappointments with installing rain barrels was I had planned to hook them all up to drip irrigation. The drip irrigation hoses need 30 pounds per square inch of pressure. And I'm sorry, I don't know what that is in metric, in order for them to work. Each foot of elevation on your rain barrel gives you 1 pound per square inch of pressure. So if I could put my rain barrels on the roof of the house, I'd get my 30 pounds per square inch. As it is, unfortunately, what I do now is I just plug an old garden hose into the rain barrels, and I've got holes poked in it, and I, turn the rain barrel on and irrigate that way. It works quite well. It's a little more primitive, but it does work. Compost and adding your own homemade compost to your soil is another great way, especially if you live in an area where you don't have perfect loam. I live really close to a beautiful riverside beach called Britannia Beach. In fact, I actually live on top of the beach because that sand comes right underneath my garden. I have amazing drainage. I have absolutely fabulous drainage. But, if we have the monsoon today, tomorrow, my garden's going to need watering again because I've got such great drainage. And that's after 30 years of amending the soil. So this is actually a picture of a rotary compost sifter that my husband made me. It uses the rims from a child's bicycle. And I guess they're about maybe 15, 18 inches in diameter. So what is that, like 45 or so centimeters in diameter? And the frame was designed to sit on top of this wheelbarrow. You can find plans for this online. It's a really easy DIY project. And believe me, it makes a huge difference because I don't like putting chunky compost on my garden beds. But I can sieve and have a whole wheelbarrow full of really beautiful, rich, homemade composted soil in about 20 minutes using this device. So it's called a trommel compost sifter, Tromme. I think it's just one L. And you can find the plans online and on DIY sites. So we've talked about amending our soils. We've talked about mulching. We also have to be concerned about wildlife. And I do another talk on phenology, which is how the life cycle changes of wildlife are changing and in some cases getting out of sync. So we're seeing frogs breeding earlier. We're seeing eastern bluebirds, for example, migrating and laying eggs earlier. The mountain pine beetle, which has been devastating forests in Western Canada for 20 some years now, is a native beetle. It evolved with the lodgepole pines. The reason it has become devastating is because with longer summers, a longer breeding season, this little beetle now gets in 2 breeding cycles per year instead of just 1. And that has been enough that, along with bad forestry practices, to essentially wipe out huge swathes of forested land. We're also seeing some species hybridizing as their ranges overlap. And, you know, the grizzlies and polar bears is one that you may have heard about. Worryingly, we're seeing some shrinking habitats. So I have a family of chickadees nesting in my front yard right now, but their habitat is shrinking. Their southern range is moving further and further north, and because they're primarily cavity nesters, they need mature forest. So their range is shrinking in the sense that they can't go a whole lot further north than where they are because the trees aren't big enough. But they can't go further south than the weather will permit them to. It gets too hot for them. We also have a family of robins nesting at our back door, and every time I go out there, I see the poor little baby birds poking their heads out of the nest with their beaks open going, and they're not just asking for food, they're so hot. You know, I want to put a fan on them or something to keep them going, but they're about to fledge, and I think they're going to make it through, which is good to know. We're also seeing, I mentioned invasive species in the context of the emerald ash borer, but some of the other invasive species are diseases. And Nicole, you'll be familiar with things like the West Nile virus, which is an insect-borne disease. We're seeing also more of the black-legged tick, and that's associated with another invasive species, which is the Japanese barberry. It's a very, very attractive ornamental shrub, makes a great hedge because it's kind of prickly, so it's good for privacy. But it produces berries, and even though we don't let it loose in the wild, birds will eat those berries, fly off into the forest, poop out the berries, and you get whole understories that are taken over by this Japanese barberry, and that then becomes excellent habitat for the black-legged ticks, which carry Lyme disease. And most recently, we're seeing jumping worms moving into you may be familiar with these in Georgia, but they just made their way to Ottawa last year. They've been in southern Ontario for 3 or 4 years now, but we're seeing that as a big threat to gardening. This is a headline from that horrible heat dome in BC. Billions of seashore animals killed in the heat. And it's not just a question of, maybe the price of mussels or oysters or scallops goes up. These are filter feeders. They're part of what keeps the water clean. And so not only did you have beaches stinking of, dead and dying and decaying shellfish, you also had waters that were no longer being purified by these shellfish. Those forest fires that we had last year, we don't have a count of what happened to wildlife in the boreal forest, but we know that there were a lot of animals that were probably burned to death. In Australia's Black Summer of 2020, they estimate that several billions of animals were killed in those wildfires. So what can we do about things like wildlife? Well, we can certainly try to create as much habitat in our own gardens as possible. And we could provide some food. So this is a pileated woodpecker at a feeder in my backyard. This is before the cats arrived, so it's quite an old picture. Once I started getting feral cats living in our neighborhood, I stopped putting explicit food supplies out for the birds because it ended up being kind of like an all-you-can-eat kitty buffet. So this is the kind of gardening I do now. I leave a lot of stuff standing for the winter. I grow very, very densely. I grow lots of native plants, and I leave those seed heads standing for the winter. And as late as, late April, even into May, I leave those seed heads and those dead plants standing in my garden. And I will see birds, because Ottawa's on a migratory flyway. I'll see birds stopping in and having a little snack on some of those old seed heads from last year. Mullein is a great one, by the way, if you've ever seen that rather statuesque plant. It's a native medicinal plant. Some people think of it as a weed, but I just love those really tall flower spikes, and the chickadees and goldfinches are really fond of the little seeds in there as well. So actually, this is not my garden. This is from a blog called My Wildlife Allotment. Water in the garden is just an absolute magnet for wildlife. So this is a bubbling rock. I actually have a pond and waterfall in my backyard. Even a bird bath can make a huge difference. Some people do create something called bee baths. I actually don't recommend that because they can become contaminated with algae and bacteria all too easily. And then you're sort of inviting your bees to come and have a stinky bath in algae and bacteria. A much better strategy if you want to provide water for bees and butterflies is to use a conventional bird bath like the one this robin is sitting in, and just lay a piece of slate or a piece of board going into the water so that the bees and the butterflies can kind of walk in there, and it makes it a whole lot easier to clean. Something like this bee bath with all the rocks in it, you'd have to pull all the rocks out and wash them all individually and refill the water at least every day. Major pain. Like, who needs that? But it is important to keep these bird baths really clean. You can provide habitat as well. I mentioned the chickadee nesting in my front yard. It's nesting in a little bird box. They are cavity nesters. This is a great design. It's easy to clean. It's a condo design, but the position of the entry hole is far enough above the floor of the, in this case, condominium, that squirrels can't reach in and grab those little eggs. You can also plant densely. Something like this Chamaecyparis tempelhof is a wonderful, dense little shrub. I have one of these. It's like 2 feet tall, 60 centimeters tall. And I do find wildlife in there. So does the cat, unfortunately. But, it's dense enough that it will shelter small animals and birds. And then plant in different layers. so that you have this layered effect, which looks very attractive in the garden, and it provides lots of perches at different heights for birds. Some of our ground feeding birds, they're going to want to stop up here and survey things and then maybe come down to this shrub and have another look before they hop down on the ground to peck out a worm or something from the lawn. Shelter is another really important component in the garden. This picture was actually, that's that same pileated woodpecker. I was trying to get another picture of him before he took off, but what I got instead was a picture of what my garden looks like in the fall. I leave the leaves, and people who are following ecological gardening strategies are doing more and more of this. So I no longer say I'm a lazy gardener, I say I'm an ecological gardener. Because these leaves provide habitat for overwintering butterflies or for their larvae, the morning cloak butterfly. And you know, every time I clean up leaves, I always find at least one woolly bear caterpillar. You know, the fuzzy caterpillars, they're black on either end and orange in the middle. They turn into the gorgeous Isabella tiger moths, and they depend on this leaf litter for wintering over. I love to have toads in my garden. They also will winter over in this leaf litter. So all of these little critters are really desperately in need of that leaf litter. Plus which, as I said, it's a free, cheap form of mulch. I mean, think about how silly it is to go about raking up all those leaves, putting them in the compost bin, waiting for them to rot, and then sieving out all the chunky bits and putting them back on the beds. These days, I just let them lie on the beds. And in the spring, I just kind of gently make sure that the crowns of my perennial plants are not so covered in leaves that they can't breathe and penetrate through them. And the more I garden with native plants, of course, the more they appreciate that leaf litter. In fact, one of the issues in forest understories in parts of southern Canada is that earthworms, which are an invasive species for the most part, there's a few native earthworms, but most of them were wiped out by the glaciers during the last ice age. So most of our earthworms are imported, and they're eating that leaf litter. And as a result, there's less duff, there's less nutrition and less protection for the forest understory plants like trilliums and bloodroots, which are so iconic in our forests. So how do our plants respond to higher temperatures? And Nicole, you asked that question about increasing VOCs. Yes, to some extent. Photosynthesis, we know, increases. Respiration, plants breathe, and that increases rapidly. Transpiration, which is plants sweating, that also increases. Some species of plants are triggered to flower by higher temperatures. Sugar storage decreases, and dormancy may be compromised. And where this becomes problematic is when we're talking about native species that require a period of cold vernalization or striation in order to germinate. If we don't get those cold snaps, those seeds will not germinate on their own.
Rebecca, I'm so sorry to jump in, but I just wanted to check in about time. We're at the hour mark, so I just wanted to do a quick check-in. I hate to do that because this is so wonderful.
Okay, well, I'm gonna speed things up then because we're almost at the end here. So good news, more frost-free days, longer growing temperature. Bad news, that reduced thermoperiod, the difference between daytime and nighttime temperature, can mean less optimal growth. Higher CO2, higher temperatures, more humid air, more nitrogen in the soil, and reduced growth. Some of our native species are threatened as a result of climate change because their growing triggers are daylight hours, which remain constant, whereas a lot of introduced species, the growth trigger is actually the soil temperature, which is not constant. That's changing as a result of climate change. So growing these plants in your garden, this is New England aster, which is gorgeous. It's a dogwood, pagoda dogwood, another beautiful plant. This is Canadian goldenrod, which I actually just ripped out of my garden this spring because it's gorgeous but really invasive. So I have a different kind of goldenrod now. The Indian pipe and the showy lady slipper, those are a little harder to grow in a conventional garden. They have some fairly precise requirements. But you can grow a lot of stuff in containers, and many of these alpine plants are some of the ones that are most threatened. Look how pretty that looks. I mean, that's probably only about 30 centimeters, maybe 45 centimeters long. But you've got like this whole little landscape in there, which I think is just gorgeous. So in terms of where our greenhouse gases are coming from, the most recent, 2 years ago, the IPCC addressed the whole issue of agriculture and land use, which give rise to about a quarter to a third of our greenhouse gases. And we know that these extreme weather events are threatening our food supply. So growing your own food is actually a really important way of adapting and learning what it is that you have in your garden that you can eat, even though you may be growing it as an ornamental. Hostas, for example, when they're at this pencil point stage, you can cover them with, or cover part of them with a bucket or something to deprive them of sunlight. Or you can harvest them at that stage and roast them. They taste a bit like Boston lettuce. They're really nice. One of my all-time favorite herbs is anise hyssop. That's this one in the middle here. Tastes like licorice. It's such a bee magnet. I have never been able to take a picture of it without getting a bee on it. There's the bee right there. There might be another bee there. And widow's tears or spiderwort, Tradescantia ohioensis. Really nice little perennial, and it's a tad aggressive, but I keep it under control by harvesting the sprouts in the early spring and chopping them up and dropping them into salads or omelets or soups or whatever. They're actually a very unique flavor, and unlike a lot of edimentals, they actually taste really good. And then, learn how to preserve your own food. This is my cold cellar. So I also have a witch hazel plant. I make my own skin toner with that. I do flavored vinegars. So I think that might be some raspberry vinegar there. And there's a finished raspberry vinegar. And then my husband and I make a ton of different kinds of jams and jellies every year. In fact, I've been harvesting service berries, getting out there ahead of the robins and the squirrels, which want to eat all my service berries. And I think I've got enough for a batch of service berry jam this year, which is exciting. I don't get that every year. So these are some of the jams and jellies that we make. These days, I used to pickle my garlic in an apple cider vinegar. Now what I do is I just mash it up and freeze it in baggies and throw it in the freezer. And that way my husband will actually use it because he's the main cook in the house. And some of those heirloom tomatoes that I grow go into a chutney, which is actually an heirloom recipe that's a couple of 100 years old. So trying to wrap this up. Oh yeah, this is an important note about health. So this is this is me dressed for the garden. Hat, sunglasses, long sleeve shirt, long sleeve pants tucked into my socks so I stay away from ticks. I'm not going to win any beauty competitions, but I'm actually very cool and comfortable, and my skin is protected from the sun and from bug bites. And if I'm out on a day when it is buggy, I'm going to use insect repellent. I avoid gardening between 10 and 2 at midday just to stay out of the heat. That's a good time to come inside, have lunch, put my feet up, maybe do some emails. I absolutely critically stay hydrated as much as I possibly can. There's the bug spray. And then ways that you can do, things you can do in your own home to adapt to climate change. Turn the thermostat down in the winter, turn it up in the summer if you are lucky enough to have air conditioning. This is the old-fashioned pink insulation. We actually added some, we had an energy audit done last year, and we had a whole bunch of insulation added to the attic. And even before we got the heat pump installed, which was just last week, just in the nick of time, we could close up the house during the day, draw the curtains, heavy drapes that have, a sun backing on them, so they let very little light and very little heat in. And the house stayed cool right through until the evening when it started to cool off again. We don't have an electric car, we have a hybrid car, and I do try and walk as many places as I can. In fact, you'll hear a lot of cities now talking about the 15-minute walkable city, largely because they want people to have access to amenities close enough to home that they don't have to get into their car. The Inflation Reduction Act that Joe Biden passed in the US in 2022 has already had a significant impact on emissions in the US, as well as on the economy and on employment. So it's that was a very significant piece of legislation. And it's done a lot to boost companies that manufacture things like wind turbines and solar panels and so forth, as well as reducing emissions. We're going to flip past this. Nature-based solutions. So this is some of the hopeful news, where this is an article from February of this year. Scientists and researchers are suggesting that nature-based solutions can play a key role in mitigating climate change. Isn't that a gorgeous tree? And I mean, that just makes me feel so hopeful that even with my tiny little garden, there are things that I can do to help mitigate climate change, as well as just adapting to it. Buying local. This is a picture of the Westboro Farmers Market, which is probably the one closest to me. As a master gardener, I'm often at these farmers markets offering advice, but when I'm not there, I'll often take a special trip just to go buy local produce. So I know that what I'm eating hasn't traveled 2,200 kilometers or 1,500 miles to get to my plate. So things that we can do ourselves, we can invest in a water barrel or several water barrels, garden organically, avoiding chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. Use muscle power tools rather than power tools. It drives me crazy when I hear people using the leaf blower. Like, just get out a rake, for heaven's sakes. Really? Do you need to use a power tool for that? I don't think so. Composting. Now, we have a green bin program in Ottawa, so there is municipal compost available, which is great for things like, meats and fats that don't go into my home compost. But I actually have, I think it's 5 streams of waste. So there's the black bin for paper, there's the blue bin for glass and plastic, there's the home compost bin, there's the city compost bin, and then there's the stuff that has to go into the garbage. But I'm very careful about separating that out. And I do compost all through the winter at home. And by the spring, that big pile has settled down, and I haven't even flipped it yet this year. So I'm, still piling stuff on top of last fall's compost. I garden to protect wildlife and native species, including planting lots of native plants. And I'm working with my neighbors to create wildlife havens and corridors. I buy locally, buy from local growers, and use renewable power. So even if you have solar garden lights, if there's a power outage, you can bring those into the house. But the number one thing, use less stuff. Buy less stuff, use less stuff. There's an option to become a citizen scientist. These are all Canadian things, but I know that many of these programs exist in the US as well. The Audubon bird count, for example, is one. And here are my key messages again. So it's not too late. There are things that you can do. I'm not going to go through this list of resources. It's a lot of reading material here. 2 that I really highly recommend: Tim Flannery's The Weather Makers, and a fictional book by Kim Stanley Robinson, who is not a great writer, but he is a good storyteller. And this is called The Ministry of the Future. It's a much more recent book, and I loved it because even though it has an incredibly gruesome start, and it's a bit of a nail biter, it talks about the social and technological fixes that we can use. And not to spoil the story, but the good guys do win in the end. So that's always good to know. Some other resources, you can calculate your carbon footprint, your water footprint, whichever municipality you live in. You may find that they have a rain ready program. Ottawa certainly does. And backyard habitat certification through the Canadian Wildlife Federation here in Canada, but there's a National Wildlife Federation in the US that offers the same kind of thing. Douglas Talame, who is in Delaware, I believe, his work has been a complete game changer for the whole gardening scene. One of my fellow master gardeners said, we used to recommend to people, plant this plant, nothing will eat it. Well, these days we're saying, well, plant this native plant because everything eats it. And we now know that, if we don't have stuff eating our plants, then we also don't get baby birds, because those little baby birds need, in the case of chickadees, 6,000 to 10,000 soft-bodied insects in order to grow up. And that's it for me. So happy to answer any more questions, or just shuffle off if you want to get going with your evening.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciated how, it started so high level and then you ended with such incredible practical tips for us in our garden. I really appreciated that, and I'm sure everyone else in the room here too. And I just have to say, I would love to come hang out in your pantry one day. That looked incredible. All your little potions.
It's also fairly cool too.
That just looked incredible. Oh my goodness, that's very inspiring. And that goals, one day I would love to have that kind of a setup. That's amazing. I see Nicole just added in the chat a comment. I was reading about the Missouri ironweed's roots can reach 12 inches down below, 12 feet down below soil surface. Hence why the colonial settlers had called it this name when they had presented challenges when clearing and plowing fields. Kind of shows how native plants can help with absorption of excess water to reduce flooding and prevent soil erosion and help with soil structure. Wow.
Well, and also be drought resistant. So you actually find that deep-rooted characteristic in a lot of the prairie plants. And it's one of the ways in which they survive long periods of drought in the prairies.
Wow. Well, I just want to thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank everyone in this room. And for those of you who are working in TH and are interested to see how we're going to tie together Rebecca's amazing presentation with our work in therapeutic horticulture, our next peer support call is on July 4th at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. And we're going to continue the conversation there and take a look at how we can, apply these principles in our work and what that looks like. I've just put in the chat a little PDF of some. Sorry, 12:30 EDT. I'm in Pacific time. Sorry. Thank you, Alexis. So that's 12:30 and 9:30 for me. I don't know what I was thinking there. Anyway, so yes, that is on July 4th. That's under the events tab on the Growth Network. And we're going to continue that discussion there. So it would be great to get your ideas and your opinions and hear about what you're doing to address climate change in your work in therapeutic horticulture. So we'll hope to see you there July 4th at 12:30 Eastern time. And just a huge thank you again to Rebecca. That was wonderful. It was so lovely to spend that time with you. And I just hope everyone has a lovely evening and that we continue to have these very important discussions.
And Nicole, I know you wanted to reach out. You can actually reach me through my my blog site. My email address is on there.
And that I did put in the chat at the beginning. I'll just bring that down again here. So it's right at the end there, Rebecca's blog and research website there. All right. Thank you so much again, everyone. Please take care and have a lovely evening.
You too. Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Stay cool.